I think you've raised an important point now about how Lula still has to win over Brazilians, because I think all of these events feature in this long-standing legitimacy crisis that Brazil has been undergoing for the last 10 years or so. And Lula's ride to power wasn't as emphatic as I think we'd all hoped, and he has a very difficult task ahead of him. The Workers' Party only controls about 12% of the seats in the lower house of Congress, and Lula himself relied on quite a broad coalition in order to get to where he is now. That includes his vice president, who is a former right-wing governor of Sao Paulo, and it includes this motley bunch of fellow socialists, centrists, and so on and so forth. So he does have quite a difficult task ahead of him. Do you think his mandate is clear? What is his strategy entering this presidency? What kind of agenda for reform is he pushing? As you said just now, he has to tread cautiously. What does treading cautiously mean as far as Lula's plans for the presidency?
Yes, well, the presence of Alckmin there was very bittersweet for us on the left, having to deal with him, especially those on the left from the state of São Paulo who had terrible experiences with Alckmin and with Alckmin's police. So, but there was this general understanding that getting rid of Bolsonaro was the most important point. And there are claims on the left within the Workers' Party, friends and comrades who have said, well, it's not that we went to Alckmin. Alckmin actually came a little bit to the left. We're going to see how that works. It is actually like a huge comeback for Alckmin in the sense that he was mostly forgotten and now he's vice president of Brazil. But Lula had quite an interesting program for his campaign. Like, I actually did like a live stream with people reading point by point. It was built by many hands for sure, because there are contradictions in the program. But I could tell, for example, contributions around the environment were actually good contributions coming from social movements, coming from eco-socialist collectives. So there were some really interesting things there that I think Lula is looking to work on. And we already see a difference here in the way that he built his ministries. So we have from the Minister of the Economy in Brazil as Fernando Haddad, who ran for president in Brazil in 2018, lost against Bolsonaro, and ran now as for governor of São Paulo. And didn't win, but is a very strong presence and being there. And this is a name that goes against the big neoliberal names that the market would expect, right? So naming Haddad was already a way for Lula saying, I'm going to do things differently here as well. I'm going to treat social spending as investment. I'm going to have a different perspective on what we're going to do in terms of money, raising the minimum wage and things like that. So Lula already signaled certain things there, where we now have proper ministry for human rights and a ministry for indigenous peoples and sports and culture. Everything's very different in that sense. But at the same time, the Ministry for Tourism and Communications, there are sectors that Lula just handed out to a party that we understand to be closer to the far right. In fact, it was part of the Bolsonarista camp before. And this helps you explain as well why Bolsonaro is feeling a little weak, is because Lula actually made deals with some of his friends. And some of his friends came over into the government. This is bad for us, but it's also bad for Bolsonaro. Lula's actually quite skilled at this game, but obviously this game leads into a lot of vulnerabilities, including the fact that over the past years, these vulnerabilities helped some of these people get more empowered, and then they worked on a coup against Dilma Rousseff, against the Workers' Party. So you guys got to be very alert on this. But we already see, we're not even a month into the government yet, and we see so much of a difference. For us, more on the radical left, as socialists, we have to keep track of how we're feeling about this all the time, because we know there are a lot of contradictions. Lula still has a project around class conciliation, but it just gives us, a little bit of hope when we're seeing that when institutions are working again, and wow, they're worried about people who are going hungry. And I remember having a conversation with a dear friend last year about this, that if Lula was able to get Brazil on track on at least 3 things, I think we would make enough of progress to justify alchemy and dealing with these contradictions, which is fighting hunger in Brazil, which is one of our main concerns. Food insecurity is something that's plaguing about half the country. And we're talking about 30 million people actually going hungry in the country. And then the situation around nature and the environment. And that's not just about the Amazon. We already see like huge difference in terms of budget, in terms of like empowering the environmental institutions within the state around it, changing the narrative away from ecocide. We are going to deal with the contradictions around green capitalism. They are making their way into the government already, but it's not just like upfront ecocide that was before. And my third point is that Brazil was becoming very isolated, even though it's a huge country in the region. And we needed to get internationalism back on the table, and we needed to get Latin American integration back on the table. And the past week, well, that's what Lula has been doing, working on Latin American integration, and it's actually been beautiful, like from like when we compare to how things were before.
Yeah, I mean, as your article touched on, the bar was so low, but even in spite of the bars being so low, I think it's impressive the advances that he's been able to make over the past month. But to what extent are his plans going to be constrained by the state of global political economy? When Lula was president, in his first 2 terms, Brazil benefited from a commodities boom, which facilitated its high growth rates and the ability for the state to invest tremendously in social spending. And at the moment, as you're describing, Lula still has plans to invest in social services and expanding welfare access. But it's a very different world from the world of 15, 20 years ago, in the sense that economic prospects globally are pretty bleak. And given the current crisis of inflation around the world and the tightening of monetary policy in the West, that might have a bit of an impact on Lula's plans. What kind of growth model do you see sustaining this presidency, especially since it cannot be a growth model that is too reliant on mineral resources, because we're facing accelerating climate change, and we want to get off the ecocidal track, as you'd just described. But then how does one generate or try to generate some kind of economic growth in these pretty restrictive conditions?
Well, one thing I know for certain, I wouldn't like to be in the Ministry of the Economy right now in Brazil, because they are dealing with it's almost like the epicenter of all the contradictions, because we need money for this social spending, and well, there's not enough in the budget. One of the reasons for this is that right after the coup against Dilma Rousseff, Brazil was put into a situation by Congress of direct austerity, right? So basically they froze spending for 20 years. And this is actually piling up. So it's getting worse year by year. So the challenge that the government has right now is to deal with the legislative on this, because this austerity ceiling can't stay there forever. And so like that, even if you do have the funds, you're not able to spend it. So this is one of the main problems right now. Something else that's on the table, like they're working on actually reforming the tax system in Brazil. It is quite a regressive tax system when we think of the taxes on consumption and the actual tax brackets that impact a lot from middle class to the lower classes. So they want to work on that. During the campaign, Lula talked about taxing the rich. So taxing big wealth. So this might come to the table, but I'm going to give like another example here of how hard it is for them to manage these contradictions in their own program. Something that Bolsonaro did during his government especially to try to win over both the middle class, but also, for example, the truck drivers that in Brazil, like they're quite important in terms of like if they block roads, they do tend to have like a more reactionary perspective. Most of them were with Bolsonaro. Is basically like he took away the tax from fossil fuels within Brazil. So this is something that the Lula government had to deal with right away, because this measure by Bolsonaro would expire at the end of the Bolsonaro government. And then the Lula government was faced with the question, do we renew this, or do we say, no, we need to go back to taxing diesel and gasoline, because well, the funds are ginormous. So we're talking about 52 billion reais. There's a lot of money in 1 year. And also the fact that if you're talking about energy transition, if we're talking about fighting climate change and making big, beautiful speeches at the UN, like Lula did at COP27, it's kind of complicated if you're just saying, well, we're going to keep gasoline and diesel and fossil gas, we're going to keep everything tax-free, right? So like not even the conversation of changing the tax system to introduce more like a carbon tax and pegging some of that income from this carbon tax to put towards transition and things like that. So this conversation led into a lot of infighting. Like the journalists kept reporting on this, like the first week of government nonstop. And that was like the first big battle that the Minister of the Economy lost, because Haddad wanted to start a tax, and other camps within the government said no. Part of this because they were afraid of truck driver mobilization, like stopping the country. And I absolutely understand this concern. I think it is a real concern. But I also think now we're like 3 weeks into the government, we can go back into this conversation of saying like maybe you shouldn't renew this forever. We need to get these funds rolling. So they are going to, like over the next few months, they're going to have to look into a lot of the actions that they were taking to not poke the bear. Let's not poke the Bolsonarista bear. Let's take it easy. But you can't do this forever, because then you're actually fulfilling their wishes. You're making it easy for them. And you're not going to be able to do the things that you promised people you would do. So this is going to be a very complicated year for the government actually to set the tone of like how they're going to do things. And I think this is why mobilization from social movements, from labor unions, from the other parties and collectives in Brazil, this is quite important, because if we don't apply pressure as well, all the pressure is going to be coming from the right wing. Nothing's going to change.
What is the state of social movements, trade unions, and the different constituent parts of the left in Brazil at the moment? Part of how this entire mess began is that the left, as it has been in every other part of the world, was significantly demobilized, dejected, defeated, and divided. Has Lula's presidency provided a unifying locus for the left, or might it only start to sow divisions further as these contradictions unravel? And the main task of preventing another Bolsonaro presidency has been achieved, but when in power, the task of governing is beset by many perils and contradictions.
Oh yeah, we're still dealing with the demobilized left. We're still dealing with people who vote for Lula, who are against Bolsonaro, but they're not organized. They're not, in militant circles. They don't consider themselves to be activists. They just say, well, now it's the job of the institutions to do all of these things. And there's a tendency right now to have demobilization go into this certain level of saying, well, but our people are in power, right? So our people are in the ministries, they're in the cabinets, they're like in the secretariats, they're going to fix things. So like Lula did this in the past. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like if you're going to have people working, for example, around right to the city in your ministry for housing, well, you should take people from the social movements who are close to everyone, who have been fighting on the ground, who are real specialists here. But this can't be understood as a way that, well, now we don't need to apply pressure from outside anymore. I am unsure, to be quite honest, how most of these movements are going to react right now. I understand this is a moment to show support for some of the actions, but we're going to have some very tough fights over the next months and years as well. And this means that we need to be able to rally people to the streets. How the Lula government reacts to this is going to be quite important. If the Lula government reacts to people taking to the streets as, oh, this is a protest against the government, then it's going to repeat mistakes it made in 2013 in Brazil, in 2014 in Brazil, that's about saying that we have nothing to do with the streets anymore. We have nothing to do with this type of radical actions of occupations. And I understand that, for example, the landless workers movement, which is still one of the most relevant social movements like in the planet, actually. The landless workers movement is a movement that did go through a level of demobilization during the first Lula mandates. That, no, we're going to negotiate agrarian reform here, and then that are being very slow. So keeping certain actions, especially actions that are not actions that deal with the executive, but that are about applying pressure to the judiciary, applying pressure to the legislative, and going after private companies, applying pressure against capital, these actions should be at an all-time high anyway. So this is something that we're going to see over the next months, like reaching that point of equilibrium, how you do that. But I understand, like, Dilma Rousseff has people over the years have always asked the Workers' Party in Brazil and Lula, like the PT needs to work on its own self-critique. So, like the things that they did wrong. And we don't usually get that from like the big names in the PT, and we don't get this from Lula. Lula has actually made jokes saying that if people keep asking me to do that all the time, I'm not going to be able to actually do the things I need to do. And he's kind of resistant to this, but there's been changes. For example, some of these big developmentalist projects that resulted in a lot of environmental damage and also like very bad social impacts. For example, the Belo Monte Dam in the state of Pará, and the impact on the Xingu River basin and what that means for the people's indigenous and traditional communities living alongside the Xingu River basin. This is something that Lula said, yeah, we shouldn't repeat this anymore. But I am unsure of how this actually gets into when we look into like the development projects in other areas, right? Sometimes you say, well, because Belo Monte was very famous, we're not going to do a Belo Monte again. Yeah, but there are no plans for something like it anymore. So we need to get people to understand the patterns itself and not just one thing that they did wrong, that they can't do the exact same thing again. But Dilma Rousseff, on the other hand, has been going about for 2 years in terms of like self-critique, things that we did wrong. Well, we fought the coup in the wrong way. We looked into like institutional powers when we should be looking to the people, mobilizing people around them. And she's been making claims that, well, there's no democracy without popular organization. So we can't say that we're taking the country back into a path of democracy by defeating Bolsonaro if we don't let popular organization flow. And this is really good. And particularly for us, like in the socialist camp, it's good to have Dilma Rousseff saying this, because at least the people who are more like in the Petista or like a social democrat camp, when they're like, wow, mobilization is going to lead into another coup, very simplistic, reductionist kind of perspective, we say, well, but Dilma Rousseff thinks it's really important to keep mobilizing. So it's good to have her as a partner here. And I was very critical of the way she handled the coup crisis from 2013 until 2016. It was something that I felt like it was very focused on the institutional powers. But I'm glad that Dilma is very critical of that nowadays too. So I have a feeling that we're better positioned this time around to tell Lula and tell the people in government that we can just keep demobilizing people and saying that the government is going to handle things by themselves. The government needs people and like taking to the streets, but also criticizing and saying, well, this is wrong. We don't want to go in that direction.